Thanks again, everybody, for being here. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge one of our members, Jim A., celebrated, is it 28 years of continuous sobriety? So we want to acknowledge Jim and anybody, yes, we got to celebrate that because you've been through a lot, Jim, and you've stayed sober and you bring so much to this church and to the recovery community as a licensed alcohol and drug counselor. So God bless you and thank you. Thank you, Lisa, too, for your word. That was great. I want to, tonight, what I want to do is, how many of you have seen a movie where they start with the end and then they go back to the beginning? Yeah, I don't know if you can name a movie that starts like that, but Pulp Fiction, Terminator. All right. Well, this is the biblical version of that. What I'm going to do for my message is I'm going to start with the ending, the end of the movie, so to speak, and then I'm going to work backwards. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to read for you Psalm 51, a portion of it as it's played out in the New Revised Standard Version. It's a psalm by King David, and it fits well with the theme of step 7. So as you listen to this psalm, think of step 7 and hear these words of David, very intimate words. It's kind of like eavesdropping on a very private, personal prayer. And here we go. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions and my sin is ever before me. Against you and you alone have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified in your sentence and blameless when you pass judgment. Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me. You desire truth in the inward being, therefore teach me wisdom in my secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and sustain me in a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. God, deliver me from bloodshed. O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your deliverance. Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you have no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. So here it ends part of David's psalm, his prayer to God. Now, the backstory, the context. King David, he's quite a character. He was born probably 3,000 years ago. He was the third king of Israel. He was one of 8 boys. He was the youngest, and as you remember, a shepherd. And there was this prophet named Samuel who was he was called by God to find the king that would be the successor for once Israel established itself as a nation. They first had judges, then they had prophets leading them. But now as they established themselves as a people with a politic and all kinds of concerns, they needed a king. And so Samuel went looking for one, and he goes through all of David's brothers, and he he says to David's father, I don't find the king here. I was told that I was going to find one among your sons. And his dad goes, well, there's my son David, but he's out tending sheep. And then they said David showed up, and he was handsome and ruddy, they say. And he gets anointed, but he's not much of a, not a whole lot to look at, but he's anointed to be king of Israel. And so fast forward, there's a point where there's this battle between the Philistines and the Israelites, and there's this guy named Goliath who's on the Philistine side. He's a giant, and he challenges Israel to a hand-to-hand combat. Nobody dares to go before him except David, who's this little squirrely guy, probably an adolescent, and he agrees to go to battle against this guy. So they put armor on him. And the armor's too heavy. You can't move with the armor for battle on. So they take the armor off, and he says, give me my sling, which as a shepherd, they would use a sling to ward off that which would threaten the sheep. And he grabs some stones, and he goes out there, and you know the story. He throws a rock, and slays Goliath. Actually, once he fells him, he cuts off his head and shows him to his people Israel, and he becomes a hero. And from that point on, he becomes more and more skilled as an army, as a warrior. He also is known for a man, they say, whose heart was set on for God and righteousness. He was a man after God's own heart. He was also a harpist. And his predecessor, Saul, King Saul, was subject to depression and would often call on David to play the harp for him to kind of help ease his depression. And when David would play these beautiful songs for King Saul, these hymns, these songs that we now call psalms, we call them psalms, music with scripture to them or prayers to God. In doing so, he would quiet Saul's disturbance in his spirit and his depression. And so David was a psalmist, he was a shepherd, he became a warrior, he became a king of Israel. And so he was a politician. He was also a guy with a lot of wives. He had 7 wives. The first was actually, his first wife was King Saul's daughter, who he was attracted to, and she was attracted to him. And yet stuff went down. You guys should read about his life. It's really like a soap opera. And then he has kids by all these other wives, and those kids don't get along. And you can't write a soap opera any better than King David's life. But David is he's amassed an army. He's created Israel as a nation. He's praying, and he's trying to use his faith in God and serve God and the people he's now in charge of. And he sends his army off to battle the Ammonites, and he stays back in Jerusalem. And it's spring. And David wakes up from an afternoon nap, and he steps out and he looks over, and the people would often bathe on the rooftops of their back then, and he sees this beautiful woman bathing. And so David, I guess, he was a man after God's own heart, but at this point he was a man after something else, if you know what I mean. And so he arranged to have Bathsheba come and visit him. They slept together, and she became pregnant. And she sent word that she was pregnant. Well, you can understand that Bathsheba's husband was in battle. He was a loyal Israelite. He was loyal to David. He was loyal to his comrades, his soldiers, and the cause. And he came back from battle. And David, his thought was, I got to cover this thing up. And what he's thinking is, I'll make sure that Uriah sleeps with his wife Bathsheba so that her pregnancy will be on him, not on me. The problem is Uriah is super loyal, and he comes to David's palace, and And he says, I can't go home and make love to my wife and have wine and a good meal when my fellow soldiers are out there in battle. I can't do that. And so he stays at the palace. David's like, uh-oh. 2 days later, he invites Uriah back and he plies him with some wine to get him drunk. So maybe, yeah, you know, Uriah will go home and want to be with his wife. He doesn't do it. So what does David do now? You remember the story? He calls Joab, who's the leader, the commander of his army, and he says, I need you to do a favor for me. I need you to put Uriah on the front lines where he's likely to get killed. And so he sends a letter with Uriah, a letter commanding Joab to put him in the front lines. Uriah carries a letter to Joab and gives it to Joab. And sure enough, Joab puts him in where the archers are and the strongest part of the Ammonite, the army. And sure enough, Uriah gets killed. So the word gets back to Bathsheba that her husband's been killed, and she mourns his death. David invites her to become his wife, and she does. And I invite you to just go to 2 Samuel, and you can read more about that story. But I share that with you because when we talk about our character defects, and when we talk about the prayer, the 7-step prayer says, God, remove from me these defects of character which stand in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. In David's life, we get to see that his act in having a relationship, an affair with Bathsheba, the ripple effect, which is a book we read as a church and studied, which talks about step 7 and the ripple effect of our character defects. And we get to see that in David's life. And I'm guessing each one of us has our own story of the ripple effect when our character defects cause harm to others and gets in the way of our relationship with God and harms others. Well, the story goes, this prophet named Nathan comes to visit David. And this is after all this has gone down. And he tells David a story. He goes, David, you know, there were two men. One was really rich, one was really poor. The rich guy had a bunch of cattle, lots of livestock, sheep, cattle. And this poor guy had one little lamb. And this guy loved his little lamb. He loved that lamb so much that he allowed it to eat from his plate and drink from his cup. You know anybody that loves a pet like that? Yeah, there's a couple of you here. But he loved that lamb. And Nathan goes, you know what happened? The rich guy was entertaining. A guest came. And you know what he did? He killed that one guy, that poor guy's lamb, and fed it to his guest. And David goes, you know what I do to that guy? I mean, that guy deserves death. He does. And you know what he needs to do is pay that guy back 4 times what he took. And Nathan looks at him and he goes, David, that's you. What you did to Uriah is what this rich guy did to that poor guy with his one lamb. That's why we have sponsors. I mean, you know, it can tell us those kinds of parables to let us know the consequence of our sin, the consequence of when we live out of our character defects. And so from that experience, we get Psalm 51. David says, like we say, when we come to terms with doing our first 6 steps, we become aware of our character defects. We all have them. And just like David, what did he do? He just owned it. He said, you know, words like, have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. I mean, what am I going to do? I am guilty of this. I am the cause of this. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. He goes on to say, against you, you alone have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified in your sentence and blameless when you pass judgment. Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me. So there it is, and I think that's the thing about that I love about recovery is that we begin with that first step, owning our powerlessness, our unmanageability. We in effect say, I'm like David too. If you want dirt, there's plenty on me. And I'm coming to you, God, with that knowledge. And I'm saying, God, I'm powerless, but I believe that you're merciful, that you do love me more than my sin, that you are, as Lisa said, you're happy when we ask. God, I don't know what to do with that part of me, but I know it's hurt me and it's hurt a lot of people. And I really feel awful about it, but I don't know how to undo it. And David just laid it out there. And in step 7, we do the same. My Creator, I'm now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. I pray now that you would remove every single defective character which stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. I'm saying this, God, because I don't want to hurt anybody, and I don't want to live in this misery, but this is who I am. There's good and there's bad in me. King David, who did so many remarkable things and wrote so many beautiful psalms. Psalm 23, how many of us have said Psalm 23? How many of us have found comfort in that psalm? I mean, over the years, what a gift to us. What a gift of faith. But here's a guy that slept with some other guy's wife, and he had him, he's arranged for his murder. Well, anybody want to share their story? But this is who we are. Christ knows it. Jesus came because he knew that. And he said, I know you're struggling. I know it's difficult to be you. I know you know what it means to be good and right and to do what I ask of you. But I also know what it's like to know that and to do the exact opposite thing and to wake up with shame and guilt sleeping next to you. I know that. And that's why, as Lisa said, we have Jesus who went to the cross to solve that dilemma, to address that struggle, and to say, love is going to conquer that. My love is greater than that. Watch, I'm giving you my son so that you can know that mercy has triumphed over judgment, that grace has come over damnation, or whatever word you want to use. I was reminded on Thursday, I was at the Union Gospel Mission talking to the guys there. And one of the things that was just really so evident there, because we talked about what it means to live as an Easter Christian, to live not on the Good Friday side of faith, but on the Easter side of faith, to live in the power that raised Jesus from life to death. And the guys, one by one, they named it as they shared. And the biggest freedom, the greatest freedom I heard them talk about was the freedom from the sin and the shame and the guilt and the remorse. They said, once God touched that and removed that from me, I didn't need a license. I didn't need another job. I could stay here forever because I'm free. And I think that's what step 7 is pointing toward. It's to saying, let's just bring ourselves to God. Let's just be honest and humbly ask and allow God to do the rest. That's the gospel. That's the good news. That's the truth. And so a little bit later, as we end the service, we're going to be sharing the 7-step prayer. And I invite you to think about that and maybe come to that prayer with any part of you that relates to David's story, and to bring that part of you to this prayer when we toward the end of our service. And I'm grateful that God is slow to anger and quick to forgive. That God is waiting and hoping that we will do that toward the end of the service, or maybe you want to do that now. I am thankful for a chance to share a bit of history. But when you think about a 3,000-year-old psalm and how really pertinent, or how much it applies to our situation today, we can see the steadfast love of God, that we're told that steadfast love endures forever. And that was there for David, and it's there for us today. Thanks be to God.